Welcome to effectively the last day. You're all still here, that's exciting stuff. I'd like to introduce myself firstly. Before we get to the introductions, we're going to do the obligatory disclaimer slide, obviously because by now everybody has seen it. But seeing as I'm going to be talking about accountability and forensic engineering, hopefully you've all actually read this slide and you haven't done like most end-user license agreements where you've just clicked through without actually reading the contents. But let me just sort of introduce myself. My name is Jordaan. I have a weird accent. I'm pretty short to most American ears. Coming from South Africa, so I know a lot of people confuse me with an Australian accent or a New Zealand accent, but I come down from a small East Coast city in South Africa, really quite pleasant, warm, sunny, engaging environment. And yes, we do have wild animals. We don't have lions in the streets, you know, all that type of thing. I've been working in forensics now for, well over sort of 2.5 decades now. And been teaching for SANS. We're actually just having a discussion about that before coming on stage. Teaching for SANS now for the last 10 years. I'm a big nerd. I'm a huge nerd, absolutely massive nerd, and I like catching bad guys. I like to sort of see some level of accountability taking place when it comes to cybercrime, the cyber threats that we face. And I wanted to really look at how we can do things better when it comes to looking at incidents. So we've got to kind of ask ourselves from a very pragmatic point of view, what do we do as society when systems fail? You know, we live in a very sophisticated, engaged society where we have certain expectations. We have certain expectations around safety, around security, around the integrity of systems. What do we do when these things fail? Well, here's the thing. In the physical world, when things go wrong, when things fail, ultimately there is some kind of consequence. Now, yes, in the most extreme situations, lives are lost. A bridge collapses, a building collapses. There's a plane crash. There's significant problems with motor vehicles. There might be problems with implanted medical devices. All of these physically engineered systems that may have aspects of failure that we've got to address. Now, the reality is, in the physical world, if one of those things happen, we demand, as society, we demand a certain level of accountability. When a building collapses, we don't just shrug our shoulders and say, oh, you know what, that building collapsed. Sorry, people's lives may be lost. We're just going to leave it at that. The reality is we demand, as a society, we demand a level of accountability. Now, we've got to start asking ourselves, why don't we have the same level of accountability when it comes to cyber systems and cybersecurity? Now, here's the reality. You know, if you look at all the different presentations and the keynotes that we've had here at RSA so far this year and this week, a lot of the prevailing themes talk about the digitization of our society, the integration of digital systems in our society, how critical digital actually is for human existence currently. The reality is the consequences of an information system's failure can be every bit as devastating as the consequence of a failure of a physical system. Yes, often when there's a physical failure, there is potentially a loss of lives. But how soon is it going to be where we might have that same consequence for a failure within a cyber system? If we look at operational technology and the security issues around that, that's probably going to happen quicker than we want to admit. But even besides that, what happens if there's a failure in a security system that leads to, for example, a patient getting the wrong medicine and dying as a result of the administration of incorrect medicines to a patient? These are all things that have consequences. And even if the consequence is not the loss of human life, the consequence can be quite material for a person's life anyway. A loss of job, a loss of employment, an impact on operational stability within an organization, an inability of, for example, an emergency service to actually respond to emergencies in a city. All of these are consequences of poor security engineering and poor security systems. So if we can hold people liable and accountable when there's a failure of physical systems, why is it that we as society are still struggling with this concept of holding people and organizations responsible for failures in information systems? So the reality is, and it's part of what we refer to from a criminological point of view, is this drive, this desire for natural justice. As a human society, we want to see justice. We want to see people held accountable when things go wrong. So we need to really relook at how we do things from a cyber perspective in terms of how do we improve our overall accountability. So let's just first look at some common definitions. And I think it's really important that we all get on the same page. One of the things that I've realized, so I come from a country where we have 11 official languages. Now that is really kind of crazy because you have 11 different languages. You've somehow got to find a common understanding between all these different languages. And this is really, really important, especially when it comes to IT and cyber and things along those lines, because different things mean different things to different people. So the first thing that I want to just categorize or define is the whole concept of what an information system is. I mean, an information system is basically a built environment that deals with how we manage, store, distribute, and process information. Now notice at this point I'm talking about information, not necessarily digital or cyber or anything along those lines, because when we talk about information systems, it's not just the technology. It's the people aspect, it's the processes, the policies, it's the entire end-to-end environment within which information exists. So it's very easy for us to focus, for example, on the technical aspects of information technology when we talk about information systems, but the technology aspect of it is only one very small part of the overall discussion point that we have to deal with. So the next one that I want to talk about is engineering. Now, disclaimer, I'm not an engineer. I'm a computer scientist, a forensic scientist by profession. I'm not an engineer. But obviously, in terms of working within the digital forensics environment, I've had to learn a lot of engineering principles and understand the engineering environment. So when we talk about engineering, basically we are talking about the design, development, deployment, and construction of systems. We are using various scientific and engineering methodologies to build different systems. So if I build a house, use a silly example, I'm going to have somebody with engineering knowledge to first design the building, design the plans, design all the infrastructure that goes into the building, then actually construct the building itself. That entire process is an engineering environment. So if you think about it, engineering involves anything that we build in its most simplistic definition. So when we think about the environments that we find ourselves in from a security perspective, those security systems that we build are engineered environments. Engineering is a fundamental aspect of building not only information systems, but also cyber systems and cybersecurity systems as well. For a group like RSA, defining information and cybersecurity should be pretty easy. But really it comes down to our cybersecurity triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Cybersecurity and information security really fundamentally revolves around those three things and actually deals with the balancing of those three dynamics. Because it is a balancing act. You know, you can have perfect availability and potentially have areas of concern in the others. Or you could have perfect confidentiality and have weaknesses in the others. It's always a balancing act. But the whole concept of defining cybersecurity and information security is to understand what we're going to talk about when we talk about a cybersecurity engineering environment. So if we think about engineering, which is a built environment or building systems, building structures, When we talk about cybersecurity engineering or information security engineering, we are effectively building cybersecurity systems. We are building those environments to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our information systems. That's fundamentally what we're doing. We are building that environment. Now, as a forensic practitioner, as an incident responder, I'm very much involved in investigating intrusions, breaches, and other kinds of cybersecurity incidents. So we've got to kind of look at what we typically do in incident response within the industry. Now, I'm pretty sure the majority of you have seen this diagram. This is the pictorial diagram, comes from the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and this looks at the typical incident response process. Now, the problem with this process is nowhere in this process do we try to address accountability at all. There's no measure of accountability in this incident response process. What we're actually trying to do when we look at incident response, the expected response, is trying to figure out what happened in the enterprise, what happened in this organization, trying to figure out how it happened. And basically, one of the more important things, if you speak to most organizations, is trying to understand from the incident what happened so that we could avoid this incident happening again. Basically, we want to learn from what went wrong, a root cause analysis, so we could actually improve our security posture going forward. But the problem is, even within the expectations of what normal incident response will be, the reality of practical incident responses for most organizations, they don't care about anything I've just said. What they care about is making the problem go away. Most incident response is akin to a firefight. There's a fire in your organization, and we call in the firefighters to put the fire out. I don't care how it started. I just want to make sure I make the problem go away. But again, the problem with this is that we are not dealing with some of the inherent things we need to address. We're focusing on the attack. We're focusing on what happened. We are not focusing on what necessarily went wrong in the system that allowed that attack to actually happen in the first place. We don't even consider any accountability in the environment at all. So in other words, we investigate an incident, we try to determine what happened, a root cause of what happened, and the only reason that we do that is we want to get back to operational stability as soon as possible, but also ensure that we can avoid this happening further by improving our security going forward. But we don't once consider, did we do something wrong in building the system? Is the system that we're using incorrect? We don't consider, are there any liability issues? We don't consider any accountability issues. But now the problem is, again, if we find ourselves in a society where society more and more is demanding a level of liability and accountability when things go wrong, we've got to ask ourselves the question as cybersecurity professionals, who do we actually hold accountable? Who do we hold liable? Now, it's very easy to say we hold the cyber criminal liable. I love holding the cyber criminal liable. For most of my career, I was a law enforcement officer, and I love catching bad guys. I love it, I love it, I love it. I know it's a bit of a perverse pleasure, but I absolutely love putting bad guys behind bars and making sure they go to prison. But the problem that I found working cyber incidents, both when I was still working in law enforcement and now that I'm in the private sector, is how often do we actually get to put the bad guy behind bars? Let's be quite pragmatic about it. If I'm being attacked from North Korea or Russia or China, let's use or Iran, the sort of the big threat actors out there, how many of those countries are going to extradite their citizens to come and stand trial? Like, I can do the best investigation in the world, I'm never going to get that guy in a prison cell. That's the reality. So it's a bit of a hollow victory sometimes when we're doing an investigation. There's a demand from society for accountability, and we don't get to truly get accountability because the person that we actually wanting to hold accountable, we can never get into our countries necessarily to do that. So that's a big problem for us. So is there another way we could look at accountability? Now, I know this is going to be a little bit controversial, I admit that, but when it comes to holding organizations or institutions liable for cybersecurity incidents, is it not possible that there could be some type of contributory liability or accountability that can be associated to the organization itself? So, for example, I'm a motor manufacturer and I manufacture a car that has a material flaw in it. And I'm not a motor manufacturer, and what I know about cars is dangerous. I know that's not a very manly thing to say, but I know where to put the gas in and I know how to make sure that the car runs, but anything else beyond that, I'm a tech nerd, not a car nerd. And the reality is, if something goes wrong with the manufacturer design of that car, and you have a driver behind the wheel of the car, has an accident, kills somebody, is that driver liable for their actions if they were negligent? Yes. But the manufacturer may be equally liable for that incident as well because of the flaws within the engineered system. So the reality is, it is possible for us to potentially look for accountability and liability in the management of an organization or even in the cybersecurity function of an organization. And this is where it gets a little bit controversial because it means holding ourselves liable to a certain standard of conduct. So how do we bring forensic engineering into this whole concept? Well, forensic engineering is largely about doing an investigation to figure out what went wrong and if there's anybody that can actually be held liable for it. So if we look at it in a digital situation, it's basically somebody like me coming in and doing a digital forensics investigation after something has gone wrong, after a breach, after a compromise. And not only am I focusing on the breach itself or the incident itself, I'm also looking at investigating the entire cybersecurity infrastructure, the entire security system of that organization to see whether or not there was contributory liability from the organization to that incident. I'm also, if I'm applying forensic engineering properly, I'm also identifying the actual root causes of failure. It's very easy for us to say the root cause of failure is the hacker got into our system. Easy, very, very easy to say that. But how did the hacker get into our system, and what did we potentially do that allowed that hacker to get in? And lastly, with forensic engineering, we're also trying to establish legal liability. Who could potentially be liable from a legal perspective? Now, why is this issue of legal liability such an important consideration? Well, many regulators around the world, so various countries around the world have implemented legislation to regulate aspects of cybersecurity. So if you look at Europe, you look at GDPR, and every country within the European Union has embraced legislation to give effect to the protections that GDPR provides it. There's certain states in the United States, for example, that have introduced legislation. We don't yet have a federal law in the United States that covers it all, but I'm sure it's only going to be a matter of time before that happens. So the reality is more and more the legislatures, the elected officials through laws are starting to hold organizations liable for their actions. So one of the things that a forensic engineering environment is going to do is actually look at how do we establish that legal liability. Is there somebody that should be held liable for that incident or not? Now, here's the thing when it comes to forensic engineering investigations. The legal standard that we apply for looking at liability is what we would refer to as negligence. So in a criminal investigation where I'm investigating the hacker, for example, I would need to prove that the hacker had the intention to commit the crime. But with cybersecurity, when I apply a forensic engineering perspective, I merely need to prove that the person or the parties liable were actually negligent. They did not apply due diligence. They did not apply reasonable standards. So an aspect of forensic engineering is actually establishing that. And that's established through something in law which is referred to as the reasonable person test. It has different names in different countries around the world, but the gist is still the same. Basically, it takes that organization or those individuals within that organization, and it sees whether or not their actions were appropriate and acceptable for what a reasonably skilled professional in that environment would do. So the problem with this is there's not a hard and fast guideline. What is reasonableness? You know, with the security that a Fortune 500 company has, would we expect a mom and pop shop, you know, in a corner shop to have the same level of security? Is that reasonableness? So the concept of reasonableness in law is still somewhat vague, but it is important that we have to consider this when we look at the aspects of negligence. Now, when we start to do a forensic engineering engagement, we are doing more than just investigating the IT. We are doing more than just imaging hard drives and obtaining memory images and doing all of the other traditional digital forensics activity we're doing. Because effectively what we're doing is we are focusing on looking at the overall technical system. So we're going to be looking at the actual products and systems involved that have been compromised. We're going to look at the instructions that are available for those products and systems, and we're going to see how they've effectively been utilized. Now all of this comes from how to put it this way. All of this comes from the University of Delft's forensic engineering faculty, which refers to something called the treehouse of failure model for forensic engineering. And this is a really robust model which basically provides us a guide on how to do these forensic engineering investigations. So I'm going to break each one down into a separate category to say how we would do the investigation or what we would look at. So the first part of it, and again, this is very similar to what we would normally do in a normal digital forensics or incident response investigation, I'm going to look at the products or systems. So in other words, I'm going to look at how the technology was impacted by the attacker, what systems were affected, how the attacker got in. I'm going to look at things like configurations and setups and accounts that we used, and you know, I can sort of go on for hours and hours and hours on what we could do here. But this is fundamentally traditional incident response work. I'm trying to figure out what went wrong. But I'm taking it one step further. I look at all of the systems that have been affected by that incident, and I try to determine whether or not that system actually contributed to the incident itself. So was there, for example, a really bad vulnerability in the system? Maybe the firewall was breached. I'm just using a hypothetical. And there was a crucial vulnerability in that firewall that contributed to that incident. Could that be a contributing factor? I could look at the built system. Was there a problem in how the system was set up? So I'm effectively addressing the integrity of the system. Does that system or product do what it was supposed to do? So to give you an example, I'd worked on a case fairly recently where a company that we were representing wanted to sue a manufacturer because they had been the victim, or sue a particular security vendor because they'd been the victim of a ransomware incident. And they wanted us to find evidence to sue the vendor. And the reality was the vendor's tool worked exactly the way it was supposed to do. It met the integrity test, meaning that the vendor could not be held liable for that failure. The second thing we talk about when we look at the actual system or the product is we look at something called ergonomics. Now, I know when we think about ergonomics, for most of us, that's the kind of chair we sit in or the desk we use, or all those kind of human interaction things that we have in the system. But when we talk about information security and information security systems, it's the intuitiveness of the system, the understandability of the system. Is the system engineered in such a way that it's easy to use, that its function is actually discernible? You don't want to have a situation where the tool that you're using is so inherently complex that you need to have like 10 PhD degrees to work on the system. So we also have to consider the system from an ergonomics point of view. Now, from an accountability perspective, this is one of the biggest areas we have a challenge in, legally. Because when you deploy a solution or you deploy a pre-made technology in your environment, you are limiting liability of that vendor. Because how many people here, honestly, just by show of hands, how many people here read every single user license agreement for every single tool, product, or system that you use in your environment? Okay, I saw half a hand going up there, sort of like, okay, maybe I did like 90%. But the reality is, vendors protect themselves legally by putting language in their end user license agreements and their contracts that limits liability if things go wrong. So even if you have the best intentions of trying to hold a vendor liable, if there is something that goes wrong, they turn around and whip out the end user license agreement and say, well, you actually agreed to this, you're using our product, we don't have any liability. Now, I don't know, at some point, we'll probably see legal challenges to that going forward in the future, probably from the regulators themselves, but we'll see how that plays out. The other aspect we need to look at when looking at the technical systems is we actually need to look at the instructions for the system itself. This is the standards, the rules of engagement, the procedures that we set up in place. And there's various levels that we can look at this. So for example, maybe you're in an industry that's regulated by government, and government sets the standards, government sets the criteria. So if you look in the United States, for example, in the federal government system, you've got the Federal Information, the FIPS standards, for example. Are those standards appropriate? Are those standards understandable? Could you make sense of them? Could you develop your systems and build your systems around those standards? Maybe the industry that you're in has certain rules or protocols. Were you actually able to build your systems correctly around those protocols? Maybe it's the manufacturer. Always a joke. I love to build these kit-built furniture, the sort of stuff that you get from IKEA, but I live in South Africa, so we don't have an IKEA. So my kit-built furniture usually comes from China, and the instructions are clearly not written in English, so the translations don't always equate. So I always never build the things correctly. But that's also a problem with a lot of the tools and the systems that we use. If the instructions from the vendors, the actual configuration information is problematic, could that lead to liability issues? And then lastly, we could actually look at the rules within the organization itself. Could the way we tell our organization to use these products have an impact on the technical system? So, for example, the case that I was mentioning a bit earlier where we've been asked to see whether it was possible to sue a particular vendor. In this instance, the organizational rules that had been set up for the deployment of this product were so bad that they were actually not utilizing the product to its full capabilities. And the product actually did do its job to a point, but it failed because the organization failed with the deployment of the tool. The last thing that you want to look at as well, when you're looking at the overall technical system, is basically how the system is used in the organization. So how it's implemented. Did they actually do what they were supposed to do? Are they using it correctly? And to look at this, you've actually got to look at a couple of areas. You've got to look at the knowledge of the people that are using these tools. Are they adequately trained? Do they have the right skills and knowledge? Do they know what they're doing? Has the organization set up appropriate rules to use the technology? Do the users actually have the right skills? All of these are critical because each one of these could be a point of failure and ultimately a point of liability when there has actually been an incident. So I want to talk about a case study that I worked on which really kind of emphasizes all of this and brings it all together. In 2020, just after the start of the whole pandemic thing in South Africa, Experian was a victim of a cybercrime in South Africa. There was a data breach that exposed the personally identifiable information of almost every South African citizen in the country, exposed business details of well over 60% of all businesses in South Africa, so that was including things like bank account numbers. It was a really, really, really significant breach. Now, just to sort of, when we talk about breach, most people think, oh, this was like a horrible cyber attack, some hackers got in and breached the system. It wasn't a cyber attack initially, we didn't know that at the beginning, but it was actually a good old-fashioned fraud. So social engineering is fundamentally involved with this. But one of the things that happened, because so much personal information had been exposed, the information regulator of South Africa who is responsible for these kind of privacy issues, demanded that an investigation be done into Experian. The issue with Experian, and there were two parallel investigations running. On one hand, there was the criminal investigation, which we were supporting in our investigation. So we had the criminal investigation proceeding down a particular angle. And we got appointed by the information regulator not to pursue the criminal. And that's kind of weird, not to pursue the criminal. The information regulator wanted us to conduct an investigation of Experian and determine whether or not Experian had not acted reasonably when it came to securing the information of so many data subjects. So that was the sort of the end point, that the regulator wanted to make an example of a business for poor security. And we've seen that around the world. Europe is kind of, well, there's been a number of examples in Europe with this British Airways, and a number of other big corporates have been hit. But when we did this investigation, one of the things that was really, and I have to take my hat off to Experian, Experian had learned from the lessons of the previous breach they'd had a few years earlier here in the United States, and had actually invested very, very heavily in their security systems. And we looked from an engineering point of view at the end-to-end system, like literally every single aspect that we've covered now. So we looked at the products and technologies. We looked at how they were deployed. We looked at the standards that they complied with. We looked at how these things were implemented in their organization. We looked at their policies and procedures and processes. We looked at their internal training. We literally looked at the entire engineered cybersecurity system of Experian. And over that entire investigation, we were able to prove very, very objectively that Experian had certainly acted reasonably. They hadn't been negligent in any way. We were able to establish the root cause of the problem, of the incident. And the root cause was actually a single employee of Experian that did not follow the approved rules and procedures. She had been trained. We had proof of her being trained in these procedures. We had all the evidence that supports that Experian had did exactly what they needed to do to build a robust system, to make sure that there was integrity in the system, to make sure that there were rules in place for the building of the system, and to take it from there. And at the end of the day, we were able to report to our national regulator and say that Experian had no culpability, had no liability for this breach. Now, that's quite a significant thing, because one of the aspects with a lot of these regulator-type investigations around the world is the regulator can impose quite significant fines. You know, in our legislation, the maximum fine is 100 million rand, which is not much when you look at dollars. It's about $25 million, more or less, with the way our currency works at the moment, or currency is at the moment. But it's still a significant amount of money. You know, for a South African organization, that would pretty much cripple it. They would knock it out of business completely. So the reality that because we were able to do a proper forensic engineering investigation, we were able to actually show that Experian was not at fault, and they were not liable for these regulatory issues that had been imposed on them. Now, obviously, the investigation could have gone the other way. The investigation could very easily have shown that there was negligence or culpability, in which case the regulator would have imposed a fine on Experian. Like I said, thank goodness for Experian, they had learned from previous breaches that they'd had, and they'd really built a very robust system. So I do take my hats off to the systems they've built in place. So the reason for this discussion around the Experian case and similar cases that we've investigated is that more and more organizations around the world, government regulators, are starting to look at issues of liability. Again, it comes down to, as a society, we want accountability. We want people to be held accountable when things go wrong. So there is this demand for justice. So forensic engineering has to play a role in that to help achieve that. And you could do that either to show that something bad happened or to show that something bad didn't happen, that the organization did act reasonably. So where do we go to from here? What are the action steps that we can take away from this? And I think I have a few minutes before we open for questions. What can we do? How can we implement forensic engineering in our incident response processes? I think one of the things why this is so important is we have to create a culture of accountability in our organizations. If we look at our organizations, let's just look at it from a personal information perspective. If an organization holds my personal information, and I say that as a service provider, as somebody that does forensic investigations, I take into my possession a lot of personal information, a lot of company information. I should be held liable for the security of that information. If there's a compromise, I should be held liable. And I think that's really important, that we need to accept, like any other professional industry out there, that we have to accept liability when we do things wrong or when we have been negligent. And I know it's not a very nice thing to talk about, because nobody wants to be raked over the coals for something that they've done. But as a profession, we have to accept that what we do impacts on lives. What we do impacts on organizations and impacts on countries. So we need to start holding ourselves accountable through a culture of accountability. So what's our call of action? What are the things that RSA asked us to do as speakers, and you've probably seen the slide in every presentation you've gone to, is to issue out a challenge, a call to action to our audience, to what you can do in your own organizations. So what I'd like to challenge you is to go back to your own organizations, and next week, once you've had a time to decompress from the craziness that is RSA, go and have a look at your own incident response policies and procedures, and actually really look at them to see whether or not, when you are doing an incident response engagement, you're considering the whole system. I know we may not think about looking at the whole system, but if you have a regulator or somebody else that's going to come in, like let's say a client decides to sue you, they're going to want to look at your whole system. So you actually want to do this to protect yourself more than anything else. In the next couple of months, just take those incident response policies, and if they don't consider the whole technical system, adjust them, modify them, so that now when you look at doing incident response, you consider an incident, look at the whole end-to-end technical environment. Look at it because you want to identify potential liability issues for your organization, that should an incident happen, you don't get caught holding the bag. That's the real important thing, is that in the kind of litigious society that we live in these days, anybody could sue you. And I want to try and avoid that by making sure that every organization at least has the tools to protect themselves from that eventuality. And then lastly, within the next 6 months, where possible, look at developing your own forensic engineering capabilities in-house. And if you don't have the capability in-house, talk to your service providers that you currently use and see whether or not they are looking at these aspects. Now, I know in the United States, it's a very fragmented regulatory environment, because you've obviously got to deal with state and federal legislation, as opposed to those of us that are in EMEA, for example. But the reality is worldwide there is a real drive, a real push to accountability in our industry, and it's been driven by governments. And the last thing I want to have happen to anybody in this room or anywhere else where I've spoken about this topic is for us to find ourselves in a situation where we get hammered for a flaw in our technical systems that we could have actually identified and dealt with if we'd actually focused on the whole end-to-end investigation. Oops, and that is my spiel. So thank you very much. I don't know if there's any questions. Do we have time for questions? We've still got 10 minutes. Okay, awesome. So if there's any questions, please, I open the floor to questions. Look forward to questions or virtual rotten tomatoes or anything along those lines.
Hello. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're being from South Africa and not in the United States, if you can answer this question, but I started my career as an engineer, and I was first going to go work in the nuclear power industry. And of course, if you're going to sign off draft documents at a nuclear power plant, you have to be a PE.
Yeah.
Now, we've got all these certifications, CISA, CISSP. Have you heard of any movement toward coming to a professional cybersecurity engineering certification in such that It would help indemnify the users because they're following best practice, and indemnify the company because they hired a certified or professional cybersecurity engineer.
Excellent, excellent question. So in the United States, I don't know of any movement towards that, but from an international professional body perspective, both the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers that I'm a member of and the Association for Computing Machinery have been pushing for professionalization in the sort of more in the IT space, but there's a lot of talk about professionalization in cybersecurity. And in fact, I think it was the Department of Homeland Security a few years ago actually released a position paper document here in the United States calling for the professionalization of cybersecurity because of the impact on the country. So I'm going to assume that it will happen at some point. I can tell you now, currently in South Africa, our national regulator for the engineering profession is talking about including cybersecurity within our registered engineering environment. So you'll actually have to be a registered engineer to do that. Cool.
I'm really pleased to see this principle coming to fore, because for a long time we've been trying to promote shifting these principles left into threat modeling, where we're all familiar in this room with the acronym STRIDE. Put an R at the end of that, call it Strider, and look at responsible use as root cause for cybersecurity, so that you're looking at, does the organization fund training well enough? Does the organization, are they understaffed, and so on and so forth?
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. And I think for me, it really does come down to responsibility. You know, my wife was a medical professional. She has to adhere to certain standards. You know, if something goes wrong, she gets held accountable. But the work that I do, you know, I'm just going to talk as a digital forensics professional, the work that I do actually has an impact on a person's life, whether they go to prison or not. I should be held accountable because I have just as much impact as a medical professional. Cool. Okay, it doesn't seem there's any more questions. So thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoy the rest of RSA. And hopefully I will see you all next year or at some other conference or event. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.